I'm Gloria Ledoux here on the CU Compliance Connection by League InfoSite, bringing you the compliance outlook for a review of the laws and regulations that are impacting credit unions in the third quarter and what credit unions should start preparing for in the fourth quarter of 2017. First, we will briefly review Phase 2 of NACHA's same-day ACH changes that credit unions were required to implement in September, and the third-party sender registration requirements for originating depository financial institutions, or ODFIs. Then we will touch on the final changes to the Military Lending Act related to credit cards and the calculation of the Military Annual Percentage Rate, or MAPR, that became effective in October. No, we are not done yet. The third quarter was pretty busy for us. We also have the first set of changes related to the CFPB's mortgage servicing rules becoming effective. Maybe some good news and a little bit of relief was the delay of the Department of Labor's Fiduciary Rule, which was scheduled to have an effective date of June 9th. Credit unions now have until July 1st, 2019, is a transition period to comply and implement any necessary changes associated with the exemptions. Yes, I know that this slide is slightly shocking, but please don't get too excited. Even though we don't have any regulations becoming effective, we sure do have quite a few that will become effective in the first quarter of 2018. And this is the perfect opportunity to dot our I's and cross our T's to make sure we are fully prepared. All right, let's kick it off with NACHA rule changes. Credit union RDFIs, or Receiving Depository Financial Institutions, effective on September 19th, are required to process same-day ACH debits and credits. This is phase 2 of a 3-phase transition under these rules. Last September, credit union RDFIs were required to accept same-day ACH credits only. Now, credit union RDFIs are required to accept same-day ACH credits and debits by the end of their processing day. In phase 3, which becomes effective on March 16th, 2018, credit union RDFIs will be required to process same-day ACH credits and debits by 5 p.m. their local time. I keep this helpful chart from NACHA in the slides because it does a nice job of summarizing the changes related to the processing deadlines and effective dates. Now, another NACHA amendment becoming effective in the third quarter is related to third-party sender registrations. If your credit union is an originating depository financial institution, or ODFI, you are required to identify and register your third-party sender members. However, as an ODFI, even if you do not conduct third-party origination, you are required to access the registry and acknowledge that in a statement to NACHA. While this amendment became effective on September 29th, when the registry officially opened and became available, credit unions have until March 1st, 2018 to complete the registry. Remember, even if you don't have any third-party sender members and you are an ODFI, you still need to access the registry to indicate that. Also, please keep in mind that if at some point in the future the credit union does obtain third-party sender members, there are timing requirements. So within 30 days of transmitting the first entry on behalf of the third-party sender, you have to get those members added to the registry. So this isn't a one-time deal. Make sure you have appropriate procedures in place. At the beginning of October, credit unions were required to comply with the final changes related to the Military Lending Act. This portion of the rule applies specifically to credit card accounts, requiring credit unions to calculate the Military Annual Percentage Rate, or MAPR, for covered borrowers. In this calculation, credit unions can exclude fees from the MAPR calculation that are bona fide and reasonable. So credit unions will now need to determine if their fees meet that bona fide and reasonable standard in order to safely exclude them from the MAPR calculation. In order to help determine that reasonable standard, CUNA has developed an interactive spreadsheet to assist credit unions, which can be found in the compliance community under Compliance Resources. On to the overview of the first set of changes to the mortgage servicing rules that become effective on October 19th. First, credit unions will need to update their policies and procedures for evaluating loss mitigation applications to include the requirement to promptly identify and obtain documents or information not in the borrower's control if the credit union is requiring that information for loss mitigation options. The credit union will need to conduct reasonable due diligence in order to obtain the documents or information being requested, and will be prohibited from denying a complete loss mitigation application because the credit union lacks that documentation or information unless they meet certain conditions. There were also some changes made to the notices required to be sent to the borrower before the credit union charges for force-placed insurance. Regulation X, or RESPA, provides credit unions with model language to use for these notices. These were amended to include a reference not only for situations where coverage has been expired, but for insufficient coverage as well. The timing requirements still apply for reminder notices, which requires that the initial written notice be provided at least 45 days before assessing a fee, then again after 30 days or 15 days before actually implementing the fee. As always, credit unions are encouraged to use the model language within the regulation to ensure a compliant safe harbor. Under the mortgage servicing rules, credit unions have to establish or make good faith efforts to establish live contact with a delinquent borrower no later than the 36th day of a borrower's delinquency. The amended rules require the credit union to make good faith efforts to establish live contact again no later than 36 days after each payment due date, as long as the borrower remains delinquent. Credit unions should ensure their policies and procedures are amended to reflect this change. Similar changes were also made to the written notice requirements that require a credit union to provide a delinquent borrower with written notice no later than the 45th day of the borrower's delinquency. Amendments now require the credit union to provide notice again no later than 45 days after each payment due date, so long as the borrower remains delinquent. Again, credit unions will also want to make sure their procedures are updated to comply with these new requirements as well. Credit unions will also need to make sure they are aware of a partial exemption to the early intervention live contact requirements when either a borrower on a mortgage loan is a debtor in bankruptcy, or when the credit union is a debt collector under the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, the FDCPA, and the borrower has provided notification under that rule. A credit union would also be exempt from the written notice requirements if there were no loss mitigation options available. However, if any loss mitigation option is available and either of those two conditions are met, the debtor in bankruptcy or invoked protections under the FDCPA, the credit union servicer must comply with a modified written notice. That means the typical written notice they provide borrowers will need to be modified to remove any request for payment. Additionally, the credit union is not required to provide the written notice more than once during a single bankruptcy case. Keep in mind, if the member is both a debtor in bankruptcy and has invoked protections under the FDCPA, the credit union servicer is exempt from the written notice requirements. Also, keep in mind that if you have a borrower that was previously exempt from the notification requirements because they were a debtor in bankruptcy, the credit union is required to resume compliance with the rules after the next payment due date that follows the earliest event of either the bankruptcy case being dismissed, the bankruptcy case being closed, or the borrower reaffirming personal liability for the mortgage loan. The credit union is not required to resume compliance with the live contact early intervention requirements if the borrower has discharged personal liability on a mortgage loan pursuant to Chapter 7, 11, 12, and 13 of the Bankruptcy Code. However, for the written notice requirements, the credit union must resume compliance if the borrower has made any partial or periodic payment on the mortgage loan after commencement of the borrower's bankruptcy case. There were also changes made impacting the required loss mitigation procedures. We are touching on them briefly here, but credit unions are encouraged to conduct further research to make sure they're compliant. One change was the ability for the credit union servicer to offer a short-term payment forbearance program or a short-term repayment plan to a borrower based on an evaluation of an incomplete loss mitigation option or application. There are certain notice requirements that the server must provide when offering one of these programs to borrowers. For example, the notice must indicate that the evaluation was conducted based on an incomplete application and other loss mitigation options may be available. There were also changes made to the written notice that is required to be sent to the borrower after receiving a complete loss mitigation application within 5 days. Lastly, related to loss mitigation procedures, there were changes related to mortgage loans where servicing is transferred. So if the credit union is acquiring servicing rights, the credit union must comply with the loss mitigation rules that apply to the loan prior to the transfer and within the time frames that were applicable to that servicer that transferred the loan. The last change we will discuss regarding the mortgage servicing rules are the changes for periodic statements if a loan has been charged off. The amended rules indicate that a credit union servicer is exempt from the periodic statement requirements if the loan has been charged off in accordance with loan loss provisions and the credit union will not charge any additional fees or interest on the loan. Additionally, the credit union has to provide the notice indicated on the screen within 30 days of charge-off or on the most recent periodic statement. There are also a significant amount of changes that will become effective in April of next year related to the periodic statement requirements for borrowers in bankruptcy and policies and procedures related to the termination of treatment of successors and interest. So stay tuned for another Compliance Connection video with more details on those changes in the future. Lastly, we wanted to draw attention again to the Department of Labor's Fiduciary Rule amendments, which, for use of certain exemptions, has been proposed to be pushed back to July 1st, 2019. First and foremost, the revised rule requires that all financial institutions, including credit unions who are giving investment advice concerning investment retirement accounts or IRAs or other retirement accounts covered under the rule, have to be in the best interest of the retirement investor. That means that the advice must meet a professional standard of care, must be based on the interest of the customer. Charges can be no more than reasonable compensation, and there can be no misleading statements about investment transactions, compensation, and conflicts of interest. These are considered to be the impartial conduct standards, and credit unions are required to comply with these provisions on the effective date, June 9th, 2017. Credit unions who have employees or relationships with broker-dealers where there is any compensation associated with the recommendation or investment advice associated with an investment retirement account or an IRA may need to utilize an exemption under the rule in order for that transaction to not be considered prohibited. Okay, moving right along, you will see that we don't have any changes that actually become effective in the fourth quarter of this year. But that does not mean that your workload will be light. Take a look at some of the heavy regulatory changes that are becoming effective in the first 2 quarters of next year. Starting at the top of the list is all of the annual threshold changes and adjustments that are made every year by the CFPB, the FRB, and the IRS. Why are these changes so important? Well, credit unions need to make sure their systems, policies, and procedures are all updated to comply with those numerical changes each year. For example, if your credit union relies on its lending platform to determine if a mortgage loan is considered a qualified mortgage under the rules, the system should be updated to reflect the points and fees thresholds and the loan amount changes that take place every year. Otherwise, the credit union may be out of compliance. A huge change that hopefully credit unions are already prepared for or are almost prepared for is the changes to the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, or HMDA. We'll be summarizing some of these changes for credit unions in another Compliance Connection video. As we mentioned in this video, credit unions also need to prepare for the next phase, phase 3 of same-day ACH. There are also changes to arbitration agreements contained in loan documents and membership account agreements that credit unions need to start thinking about and preparing for. There's also the implementation of changes and new disclosures related to prepaid accounts. There's also the second set of mortgage servicing rules. Those become effective in the second quarter of 2018. And then last but not least, we have the new customer due diligence requirements that we have to be concerned about. That does it for this video. We hope this review was helpful, and we thank you so much for joining us at the CU Compliance Connection. Remember, you are not alone. Your league or your association and CUNA are there to support you with all these regulatory changes. Make sure to take advantage of the compliance tools and resources available to you, most of the time at no additional cost. Also, be sure to stay tuned for future broadcasts on issues that affect your credit union. We are here to help you at the CU Compliance Connection by League InfoSite.